And that you probably will use quite a bit in your in your various travels. So I mentioned there about sometimes we want to get some input from a user. Um, and sometimes we do need some form of input. Now, as we go through the various parts that we're covering in the course, you'll see that there are other ways in which, for the kind of work you'll be doing, that you'll be getting inputs from a user. And very often, in reality, the way you'll get inputs from models and things will be reading in a CSV file or something like that. But sometimes you do need to get the user to type something in. Okay, and when we want to do that, we can use an input statement in Python. It's actually really easy to do. So all we do is we call the input function the input to the input function. So just like the print statement had its input as being whatever we wanted to print to the screen, the input's input is also what do we want to print to the screen. This is the message that will be displayed to the user. But the difference here by calling an input function is it'll print that message and there'll be a blinking cursor then, well, in VS Code it'll appear at the top of your screen in a box with this message, and then it'll give the user a chance to type something in, and it won't carry on until the user has indeed input something. And then, unlike a print function, which doesn't have an output, a print function displays some words on a screen, but it doesn't pass anything back to the code, which is what an output, a function's output is. An input function does have an output, and the output, as you may have guessed, is the thing that it passes back is whatever the user input. Okay, so if we call an input function and say, how old are you? Once the user types that in, the input function then needs to give us its output, whatever the user typed in. Okay, and this is an example of calling a function that has an output. We need to capture it in some way. We need to catch that. It has to put it somewhere. It wants to give it to us. And so what we do is we use, we typically store that as a variable value. Okay, so what this is saying is it uses the assignment operator just as you've seen before. Whereas before we'd have had something like age equals and then 42 or whatever the number we hard coded was. Here we're saying the value I want to give age is the output from this function. So Python will call this function, the input function. It'll print the words "How old are you?" on the screen. It'll ask the user to type in something, and then whatever the user types in and then hits enter, that then gets passed back, and that will be stored as the value in age. Okay. Now, it's really important, particularly for this is a really nice example of why it's so important. Regardless of what the user types in, it will always, with an input statement, be read back as a string. Okay, so even if they type 42 with the numbers 4 and 2, that will be read back. Age will now store a string that has the characters 4 and 2 next to each other. It won't be read as the number 42. It's reading it, whatever a user input is, it's a string of characters. Now, that can be problematic, obviously, if we're asking for something like an age, because we're presumably going to want to do something with it, and we may need to do like mathematical operations on it, in which case that's going to be no good. We can't do that with a string variable type. So what can we do about that? Well, the good news is that as coders, we are all inherently wizards, so we can do something known as casting. And basically, casting is where we turn one type of variable into another. It's a bit like casting a spell. Okay, so we turn one variable type into another variable type. And we can do this as long as whatever we are trying to turn that variable into will work as that variable type and can be interpreted in that way, then it'll work. The spell will work. If it doesn't, we'll get an error. Okay, if you try to turn something that can't be interpreted in that way. So if the user were to type in Dan and we try to turn that into an integer, that's going to fall over in an error because Python can't turn the letters DAN into an integer. It can't do that. But it can turn the symbols the characters 4 and 2 next to each other into the number 42. Okay, so it can do that. Now to cast a variable into a different type, really easy. All we do is we give the name of the type of variable we want to turn it into, then open our brackets and put in the name of the variable that we are trying to perform the spell on. So here, where we said age equals input, how old are you? Here, that, as we saw before, that will the user will then input something that will be read back as a string. We can then, in our next line of code, say int, if you want to convert that into an integer, open brackets, and then pass in the variable value age, and it will turn age into an integer. So it will move away from being a string into an integer. And you can actually do all of that in one line of code, which is realistically how you'll tend to do it for something like this. We can wrap our input statement, we can wrap an integer cast around that input statement. And Python will read from the inside out. So it'll say, okay, I need to call the input function to get an input from the user. That will pass back an output. Remember, that's the whatever the user's typed in. That output will then be used as the input to this function, the integer function, which will cast it as an integer. So then the characters 4 and 2 will then be passed in and cast as an integer, and then that value will now be stored in age. Okay, so you'll get used to doing this kind of thing, and usually for casting you probably do it in one line of code, but you can do it in 2 if you prefer. But remember, it will only work if you can cast it into that format. So it's only going to work if it sees something it can interpret as an integer in this case. Now, important little note, there's some little wrinkles here. If the user were to input a floating point value, i.e. they were to be very precise about their age and say, well, I'm 42.6547, you can cast that as an integer. Okay, so it'll be read in as the string 42 full stop 6547. You can cast that in this way as an integer, but it won't round. It'll just create an int value of 42, and it'll ignore all the decimal places. So be aware of that. Although, probably if you've written this, you wouldn't expect somebody to put in a decimal place, but there may be other applications where you do. But it won't work for strings, so you can't cast. Sorry, yes, I've confused myself there. If you have a float value, ignore this input. If you have a floating point value of 42.6547, you can turn that into an integer. You can cast it as an integer, and it'll give you the value 42, and it'll ignore the rounding. But it won't work if you were to use it for something like this, for an input, and the user were to input 42.6547, because that will then be, as an input, it'll be adopted as a string. So a string will then be stored that has the characters 42 full stop 6547. You can't then cast that as an integer. It will fall over. And you can see how confusing that is, because I just confused myself by doing that. And I found this out by accident by doing something else later in the training. So I thought it was worth flagging up. You probably won't encounter it, but just in case, particularly if you're either getting an input from the user or reading something in from a file, and it's a string that is representative of a floating point number, you cannot cast that as an integer. It won't work. You'd have to cast it as a floating point number, which is probably what you want to do, but just be aware there is that little quirk.